The pups were too quiet. That was the first thing Marin noticed. 4 small bodies pressed against her sides beneath the travel cloak, breathing in careful, shallow rhythms, the way young ones learn to breathe when noise meant danger. She had taught them that in the Watchtower's cellar over 6 weeks of waiting, and now, crouched behind a collapsed shepherd's wall with frost seeping through the knees of her breeches, she understood she had taught them too well. They were 4 years old, and they already knew how to disappear inside themselves. Kale was 3 steps ahead, his healer's satchel swinging against his hip, scanning the tree line with the focused stillness his father had passed down to him the same way other men pass down axes or debts. He was 17 and not a fighter, and Marin was 22 and marked as an Omega by birth. And together they had gotten 4 pups out of a locked tower in the high dark before the watch changed. She was not certain yet whether that made them brave or reckless. What she was certain of was the pull. It came from the north, as it always did, a low, warm pressure behind her sternum that had no name in Omega doctrine, because Omega doctrine said she should not feel it at all. You are made to serve, the Tower sisters had told her, not to want, not to reach. The pull disagreed. The pull had been disagreeing for 3 years, quietly and without her permission, in the direction of the Ashvale borderlands where the Alpha King kept his court and his silence. She pressed her hand flat against the nearest pup's back, the girl with the red hair, Fen, who had stopped flinching at sudden sounds only 2 weeks ago, and told herself the pull did not matter. What mattered was the frozen road ahead, and Kale's certainty that his father's safe house stood 2 hours' walk through the pines, and the fact that no alarm had yet rung from the watchtower behind them. She listened. Nothing rang. They moved. 3 years earlier, Marin's life had held a shape she understood. She rose before dawn in the Watchtower's eastern dormitory, prepared medicinal tinctures under the supervision of Elder Sora, distributed meals to the newer Omegas, and kept her eyes down when the tower guards made their evening rounds. She was good at the keeping down part. She had learned it young. The same season her mother pressed her hand against Marin's sternum and said, quietly and without ceremony, that the pull she felt was a flaw, not a gift, and that no one must know. Her mother had been wrong about many things. She had not been wrong about that. The Watchtower held 43 Omegas when Marin arrived at 19. It was not a prison in any language the ruling council used. It was a sanctuary, a place of order and protection, and the gates had locks only on the inside. This was the thing they said. Marin had checked the gates in her first week and found them locked from both directions, which told her most of what she needed to know about the difference between the things people said and the things that were true. She had not tried to leave. Not then. The life inside was bounded and cold, but it was survivable, and she had not yet been given a reason sharp enough to make survival feel insufficient. The reason arrived in the form of 4 pups in a cellar. She found them in the 2nd year, following a sound she was not supposed to have heard, a thin, persistent noise beneath the floorboards of the tower's supply annex, something between a whimper and a held breath. She had been collecting dried sage when the sound reached her. She set down her basket. She knelt. She found the seam in the floor. Below was a room that appeared in no floor plan she had ever seen. It held 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, sitting in the careful geometric arrangement of very young things who have been told to be still so many times they have begun to believe stillness is the same as safety. The oldest was perhaps 4. The youngest was barely speaking. Marin looked at them for a long moment, crouched in the gap above their upturned faces, and felt something move in her chest that was not the pull, and not fear, and not quite anger, but held all 3 of them at once. She went down, The pups had no family names. They had numbers scratched into the inside of their wrists in pale ink. Designations, Elder Sora would later confirm without shame, because they were Omega-born without verified bloodlines, and unverified bloodlines made formal naming premature. This was said with the particular smoothness of a person who has rehearsed the explanation often enough to stop hearing it. Marin heard it very clearly. She asked if she could be assigned to their care. Elder Sora considered this request with the attentive blankness of someone deciding whether to grant a convenience or deny a threat, and then said yes, because Marin was a reliable presence and the pups required supervision that the tower's regular staff found cumbersome. Marin thanked her and went back down to the cellar. She named them quietly, so the names would not appear in any tower record. The red-haired girl became Fen, the tallest boy became Rook. The middle two, who were brothers with the same careful eyes, became Silt and Reed. She taught them to count on their fingers and to recognize the shapes of leaves and to breathe small when the footsteps above were heavy. She brought them extra bread in her pockets and told them stories about forests and rivers and the kinds of people who moved freely through the world. She told them about the pull, once, because Fen asked her what she was looking at when she went quiet with her face turned north. Something far away, Marin said. Good far or bad far? Fen asked. Marin considered the question seriously. I don't know yet, she said. It was Kale who changed the calculus. He arrived at the Watchtower in the 3rd year as the assistant to his father, Healer Davin, who made quarterly medical visits to service the tower's residents. Kale was 16 and too observant for his own comfort, which was a quality Marin recognized immediately because she had the same problem. He caught her bringing food to the annex floor and followed her down the stairs on the 3rd visit without asking permission, and stood in the cellar looking at the 4 pups with an expression that moved from confusion to understanding to a kind of quiet fury that made him seem considerably older than 16. How long? He asked. 14 months, she said. He nodded once. He did not ask why she had not acted sooner. He was a healer's son, and he understood that action required preparation, and that preparation required resources, and that resources required time. He simply said, My father has a house 2 hours north of the Watchtower gate. South face, green shutters, smoke from the left chimney in winter. He will not ask questions if I send you. Marin looked at him for a long moment. Why? She said. Kale looked at the pups, who had moved closer to Marin's knees with the automatic gravity of small bodies toward warmth. Because they're children, he said. Because what else do you do? It took 3 more months to gather what she needed. Travel clothes taken piece by piece from the donation stores, dried provisions slipped into a cloth bag, a basic medical kit pressed into her hands by Kale on his next visit, along with a folded map he pretended to drop near the annex stairs. The pups grew half an inch. Fen stopped flinching. Rook learned to tie knots. Silt and Reed invented a silent hand signal language between themselves and taught it carefully to the others. Marin watched them build their own small infrastructure of survival and felt the admiration of it like a stone pressed beneath her ribs. The night she chose was a new moon, no light to betray them, crossing the courtyard, a sky so dark it swallowed outlines. She woke the pups at the watch change, dressed them in layers, wrapped them under her cloak. Kale was waiting in the annex, with a rope secured to the outer sill of the storage window, which sat 4 feet above the frozen ground on the tower's blind side. The guard rotation gives you 4 minutes on this wall, he said. I know, she said. My father will be there. He'll have heat and food. I know. He was not quite meeting her eyes, the way people looked when they were afraid and did not want their fear passed on. Marin reached out and pressed her hand briefly against his shoulder. "You're a good person, Cale," she said. He made a small, dismissive sound, the way young people did when they wanted to accept a compliment and had not yet learned how. Then he handed her the rope. They went through the window in a sequence. Fen first, dropped softly into Marin's waiting arms below, then Rook, then Silt, then Reed, and finally Marin herself, lowering hand over hand, with 4 small pairs of eyes tracking her descent from the shadow of the courtyard. The cold hit like a hand against her face. The moon gave them nothing. She gathered the pups close and moved. She heard Cale drop the rope back inside the window above her. She did not look back. They were 200 yards from the tree line when she heard the sound she had been braced for. Not an alarm, not yet, but footsteps, 2 sets, deliberate, heading toward the annex from the south walkway, changing pattern from the rotation she had memorized. Someone had adjusted the guard schedule. Not tonight specifically, she told herself, just a general variance, the small administrative cruelties of institutional life. But her heart was working hard, and she moved the pups faster, and they went into the pines without speaking. Behind them, far behind them now, a bell began to sound. She did not stop. The pine canopy swallowed the bell's note after 100 yards. Marin kept her pace steady, one hand spread across the pups' backs as they moved in a cluster at her side, her other hand holding Cale's folded map, though she could not read it in the dark. She did not need to. She had memorized it 3 weeks ago, north by northwest along the spine of the ridge, down through the gully where the creek ran between ice-edged stones, then climbing again to the flat shelf where the tree cover thinned and the safe house stood with its green shutters and its left chimney and everything Cale had promised. 2 hours. She made herself believe 2 hours was achievable. Reed slipped on a root in the first half hour and went down hard on his palms. She felt him start to make a sound and covered his mouth gently with her hand. Not to silence him, she told him quietly, but to help the sound stay small until they were safe. He nodded against her palm with his whole body, the way children nodded when they were trusting you absolutely, and she felt that stone beneath her ribs push harder. She was running on something that was not quite calm and not quite fear. It was the space between them, where decisions lived. She had been living in that space for 3 years. The pull came again as they climbed the second ridge. It was stronger than usual, which made no logical sense because she was moving north and the borderlands were further north still, which meant she was moving toward it rather than away. But she had never been able to map the pull's logic onto ordinary geography. It lived in her chest like a compass needle that did not point at true north, but at a specific named person whose name she did not know, and it had been pointing this direction since the year she turned 19 and first understood what she carried. She pressed it down, the way she pressed everything down. The pups needed her feet on the path, not her attention pulled sideways to some inexplicable magnetic north that had never done her any practical good. The safe house appeared exactly where Cale's map said it would, a low stone building with green shutters that looked black in the pre-dawn dark, smoke rising from the left chimney in a thin, pale thread. A light burned behind the shuttered window. She stood at the tree line for 30 seconds, watching. Nothing moved outside the house. She crossed. Healer Devon opened the door before she reached it. He was a compact, quiet man with his son's observant eyes and 20 extra years of practice at not showing alarm. He looked at Marin, at the pups, at the dark tree line behind her, and stepped back to let them in without saying a word. Inside was warm and smelled of pine resin and something brothy and hot. The pups moved toward the fireplace the way water moved toward low ground. Davin wrapped them in a blanket he had already staged by the hearth, which told Marin he had expected them, and began ladling soup into clay bowls with the competence of a man who dealt in practical care. Marin stood in the doorway between the cold outside and the heat inside and breathed. "You're shaking," Devan said without looking up. "I know," she said. "Sit." She sat. He put a bowl in her hands. She held it and let the heat move up through her palms. Fen crawled into the space beside her on the bench without asking and leaned her red-haired head against Marin's arm, already most of the way to sleep. Rook stayed by the fire, watching the door with the alertness of a child who had learned early that warmth could be taken away. Silt and Reed sat close together with their bowls balanced on their knees, communicating something in the silent hand language Marin still had not entirely decoded. She drank the soup. She looked at the north-facing wall of the safe house. Behind her sternum, the pool turned over like something trying to wake. "There are people looking for you by now," Davin said. He said it without judgment, in the same tone he might use to say the weather would change. "Yes," she said. "The Watchtower will send to the nearest pack authority." That would be Ashvale border garrison. Her throat tightened. Ashvale. The word landed differently than it should for a person who had no connection to that territory. How long before they arrive here? If they ride at dawn, 8 hours to this road. Less if they know the forest path. He paused. "I don't think you should stay past first light." "No," she agreed. "I have cousins in the Marin Valley settlements." "No, I'm sorry, that's your name." "The Valley settlements," she said, and almost smiled. 2 days' walk northeast. Outside any pack's formal jurisdiction, they take people without questions. And the pups. He looked at them, at Fenn's sleeping weight against Marin's arm, at Rook's watchful silhouette by the fire. "The pups go where you go," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. She had not actually decided that until he said it, and the decision settled into her chest like the last weight in a scale, balancing something that had been tipping for a long time. She slept 3 hours on the bench, with her back to the wall, and Fen pressed against her side. When she woke, the sky through the shutter slats was the gray of early morning, and Devon had packed provisions into a second canvas bag, which he set on the bench beside her without ceremony. The pups were already stirring. Rook was at the window, one eye pressed to the slat. He turned when he heard her move and signed something to Silt, who signed it to Reed. "What did he say?" Marin asked. Silt looked at her. "He said the smoke stopped." She was on her feet in one motion. Devan was already at the door. "The south chimney," he said quietly. "Someone came through the south ridge in the night. They may have seen ours." He paused. "Or it's nothing." But, she agreed. They were out the door in 4 minutes, the pups wrapped and provisioned, Devan watching from the threshold with his healer's face arranged into something that was not goodbye, but performed the same function. "North by the creek," he said. "Stay below the ridgeline until the second bend." Marin nodded. "My son chose well," he said. It took her a moment to understand he meant choosing to help her. She pressed her hand to her heart once, briefly, and turned north. The creek was frozen over in the shadowed bends and running dark and shallow in the open sections where morning light had reached it. She kept the pups on the frozen parts, where their footprints were less legible. Rook had stopped being watchful and started being something more useful. He had the directional sense of a child who had spent significant time being very still and listening, and he moved at the head of their small group with a confidence that seemed to surprise even him. They had been walking 3 hours when she heard the horses. 2 of them, she could tell by the rhythm, the particular doubled percussion of hooves on frosted ground. Coming from the south, coming at a pace that was not leisurely. She pulled the pups into the dense undergrowth on the east bank without speaking, signing the small breath instruction she had taught them in the cellar. They folded into her cloak, all 4 of them, and went quiet with the thoroughness that still made her chest ache. She watched through the screen of pine boughs. 2 riders came along the creek path. They wore the gray and black livery of the Ashevale Border Garrison. She had seen that livery in Davin's firelight on an old notice board, but something was wrong with the expectation she had built. She had expected the garrison riders to move like hunters, scanning wide. These 2 moved like people following specific coordinates. Heads down, not searching. The second rider looked up briefly as they passed her position. She saw his face for 4 seconds through the pine screen. The pull moved through her like a struck chord. She had not seen his face before. She was absolutely certain of that. She would have remembered the particular set of it, the quality of looking at something difficult and not looking away from it, the way his attention moved across the landscape like something purposeful rather than hungry. She would have remembered the way the pull recognized him before her mind could form a coherent thought. Alpha, some animal part of her noted, redundantly and too late. He had already passed. She stayed still for 30 more seconds after the sound of hooves faded. Then she breathed. Then she signed to the pups that they could breathe too. Fen pressed her face against Marin's arm and whispered, barely audible, "Was that bad?" "No," Marin said, which was either a lie or a guess. She genuinely could not determine which. She moved them northeast. The recognition did not leave. That was the problem with the pull. It did not perform and retreat like ordinary emotion. It sat. It accumulated. She had spent 3 years managing it at a distance, keeping it the way you kept a coal in a tin box. Useful someday, potentially dangerous, best not touched directly. For 3 years, the distance had been sufficient. She had felt the pull as direction, not as presence, a tug on a string too long to see its other end. For 4 seconds through pine boughs, she had seen the other end. She kept walking. The valley settlements were real, as Devon had promised. They materialized on the afternoon of the second day as a cluster of low buildings and smoke and the smell of turned earth and people living without particular interference from anyone. A quality she recognized immediately and found almost unbearably appealing. A woman named Bess, broad and practical, and clearly the person who made decisions here, met them at the edge of the settlement path and looked at the pups with the particular assessment of someone accustomed to receiving people who had recently done something irreversible. "Omega?" she said, looking at Marin. "Yes," Marin said. "Watchtower?" "Yes." Bess made a short sound that conveyed complex administrative acceptance. "We have 2 other Watchtower women. The children can share the south house. It has a hearth and 2 extra pallets." She looked at the pups more specifically. "They're young." 4, Marin said. "They're healthy." "Good," Bess said, as if health were a bureaucratic requirement she was glad had been met. "Come in then." The south house was low and warm, and smelled of dried herbs and the particular animal wool smoke combination of inhabited small spaces, and the pups went inside it with the focused attention of small people calculating whether a place was safe to want. Fen put her hand on the hearthstone and left it there, testing the warmth. Rook found the window and confirmed it had a clear sight line to the path. Silt and Reed sat in the center of the room and looked at each other in the concentrated way they had when they were deciding something between themselves. Marin stood in the doorway and watched them settle and felt something she did not immediately have a word for. It was adjacent to relief. It was adjacent to grief. It was the feeling of having carried something very carefully for a long time and setting it down successfully, and finding that the success and the setting down were both true at once. She was still in the doorway when she felt the pull shift. Not stronger, not exactly, different. The directional quality of it changed, the way a sound changed when its source moved. She looked up toward the northern face of the valley, where the pine ridge curved down toward the settlement path. The rider from the creek was at the edge of the tree line. He had not seen her yet. He was looking at the settlement with the same purposeful attention he had given the creek bank. Not hostile, she understood instinctively. Looking for something specific. She pressed herself against the doorframe and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had survived by reading situations correctly, that he was looking for her. Ashevale Border Garrison. Davin had been right. The Watchtower had sent to the garrison, and the garrison had sent its riders. And somehow, this specific rider had arrived at the settlement a full day before she had expected anyone to be able to track her here. She should go inside. She should take the pups and find a secondary exit and move before he crossed the settlement line. She stood in the doorway. He turned his head and found her. The pull was not subtle this time. It was the difference between the sound of a fire at distance and the fire itself. The thing she had been managing in a tin box for 3 years moved out of its container and expanded to fill every available surface of her chest. And she was standing in a doorway, holding the jam with one hand, and she was 22 years old, and an Omega who had just broken every law governing her category, and he was riding toward her on a horse the color of storm cloud, and his face had the same quality she remembered from the creek. Attention without hunger, looking without taking. He stopped 6 feet from the doorway. The horse blew a breath through its nose. He looked at her. "You're Marin," he said. She had never told anyone at the Watchtower her own name. "How do you know that?" "Cale told me." He dismounted in a single economical motion, which did not help, and stood on the path. He came to the garrison himself this morning. He said his father might be in trouble, and that a woman named Marin had taken 4 pups from the Watchtower, and that I should find her before the council's warrant riders did. Marin processed this. Cale had gone to the garrison, to this specific garrison, this specific person. She was going to need to speak to Cale about certain decisions when the opportunity arose, but a more immediate concern was occupying the foreground of her attention. "You're from the Ashevale garrison," she said. "I command it," he said. "The warrant riders are yours?" A pause. "I turned them back this morning, when Cale came." He looked past her shoulder into the south house, where she could hear the pups moving, and Fen saying something in a carrying whisper to Rook. His expression shifted, just slightly, the way a very controlled face shifted when something got through its guard. "Are they well?" The question undid something in her she had not known was wound tight. "Yes," she said, "they're well." He looked back at her. The pull between them was so present she found it difficult to believe he could not feel it, that he was standing this close with that much attention on her face and experiencing nothing in return. But she was an Omega, and he was an Alpha, and the bond moved differently, through different natures, and she had been told her whole life that what she felt was a flaw, and so she kept her face arranged and waited. "The council will send their own riders when the garrison doesn't report back," he said. "They'll reach this settlement in 2 days." "I know. You can't stay here. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Up close, the control in his face was more visible as control, as the deliberate suppression of something rather than the absence of it. She had noticed that quality in other people only in the moments they were about to say something difficult. "Come to Ashevale," he said. She looked at him. The court is inside the formal jurisdiction, but the Omega statutes don't hold there. I revised them 2 years ago, and the council hasn't formally challenged the revision because they can't afford the political cost. He said it quickly, as if he'd rehearsed this part and wanted to get it out before she interrupted. The Pups would have full standing, names on record. The healer at court is experienced with young children. You're the Alpha King, she said. He paused. Yes. You came yourself, not a messenger, not a garrison rider, you. Yes. Why? He looked at her. Not past her, not around her, directly at her. And she watched him make a decision about what to say that was also a decision about something larger, about the size of an admission, and what it would cost him. Because when Kale described you, Theron said, something happened in my chest that I have not experienced before, and I am not in the practice of sending someone else to investigate things that matter. She breathed. The pull sat bright and patient in her sternum, and she breathed around it. I'm an Omega, she said. By the Council's law, I'm property of the Watchtower system. By the Council's law, he said, I am sovereign of the Ashvale territory, and my court recognizes no Watchtower jurisdiction. The words were perfectly level, but the steadiness of them had the quality of something held very deliberately in place. What you are to me is a separate question, and I will not say more about it than I have, because you don't know me, and you've just run 2 days through frozen forest with 4 children, and the worst thing I could do right now is press. She looked at him for a long time. Behind her, Fen appeared in the doorway and put her hand in Marin's without preamble, studying Theron with the unguarded assessment of a 4-year-old who had decided fear was optional. Are you the king? Fen asked. Theron looked at her with the same quality of attention he had given the landscape and the doorway and Marin. Yes, he said. Do you have wolves at your court? Several. Are they friendly? A pause. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the structural precondition of one. To children, he said. Always. Fen considered this carefully, then looked up at Marin. I think we should go, she said, with the conclusive certainty of someone who had just evaluated all relevant factors. Marin looked at Theron's face, at the thing he was being careful not to do with it, the restraint that was itself a kind of declaration. All right, she said. We'll come. The road to Ashvale took 3 days. Theron had brought 2 garrison horses. He rode one, Marin and the Pups rode the other, in a configuration that required some negotiation, but reached equilibrium when Rook accepted the front position with both hands on the pommel and the other 3 arranged around Marin in a manner that was mostly stable. Theron did not comment on the arrangement. He rode alongside and slightly ahead in the way of someone navigating rather than leading, giving space without withdrawing attention. The Pups decided their opinions of him incrementally. Fen had formed hers in the settlement doorway and required no further data. Rook watched him for the entire first day with the calibrated assessment of a child who had learned to read adults quickly, then pronounced to Marin quietly that evening that the king did not look at her like the tower guards looked at the tower women, which was the most precise positive endorsement Rook had in his vocabulary. Silt and Reed made their evaluation through their private language over the course of the second morning and appeared to reach a consensus, because by midday, Reed was asking Theron the names of the trees they were passing, and Silt was listening with the focus of a child preparing to memorize. Marin watched this happen and felt the stone under her ribs change its quality. Still weight, but a different weight. The weight of something being built rather than carried. She and Theron spoke in the evenings, when the Pups slept. The conversations were not about the bond, neither of them named it, by a tacit agreement she could feel but not explain. They were about practical things, which were also, she understood, not entirely about practical things. He told her about the Omega statute revision and what it had cost him politically. She told him about the cellar at the Watchtower, the Pups' number marks, the 6 weeks of planning in the pre-dawn dark while Elder Sora slept 2 floors above. He listened with the same quality of attention he gave everything, and when she finished, she found that something had shifted in her posture. She was sitting closer to the fire than she had been, closer to him, and she had not noticed the incremental movement. On the second night, the wolves came. Not aggressively. They emerged from the tree line in the particular way of wolves who understood they were on the near edge of pack territory, 3 of them, large and pale in the firelight, moving with a fluid, unhurried authority. The pups woke. Fen sat up straight with both eyes wide. Rook put himself between Fen and the trees, which was both unnecessary and quietly remarkable. Theron did not stand. He made a low sound, not quite speech, not quite a howl, a sound that lived in the interval between them, and the 3 wolves circled wide around the camp and settled in the shadows outside the firelight's reach. Pack periphery, holding position, guardians rather than threats. Fen stared at the shapes in the dark. "Are those your wolves?" she asked. "Border scouts," Theron said. "They'll keep watch tonight." Fen looked at the nearest wolf for a long moment, then lay back down with the decisive composure of someone who had resolved a question to their satisfaction. Merrin looked at Theron across the fire. He was watching her, not the wolves. The firelight gave his face a warmth that matched what she felt in her chest, and she was tired enough that her management of the pull had slipped somewhat, and the pull was taking full advantage of the reduction in governance. "You feel it too," she said. She had not planned to say it. He was still for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Since when?" A pause. "Since Cale described you," he said, "which is not an answer I can make entirely logical sense of." "You can't logic the bond," she said. "I've tried for 3 years." 3 years, he repeated, and something moved behind his eyes. Not quite pain, but a recognition of loss, the retroactive understanding of what 3 years of distance had cost. "I didn't know. You couldn't have." She looked at the fire. "I didn't know your name. I didn't know you were a person and not a direction. And now." She looked up. He was still watching her with that quality of attention that took nothing and held nothing back simultaneously. A presence without pressure, a wanting that asked rather than demanded. "Now I know your name," she said. He was quiet. The fire worked between them. The wolves shifted softly in the dark at the camp's edge. "Is that enough?" he said. "Not yet," she said. "But it's a beginning." He accepted that with the steadiness of someone who understood what patience cost and had decided the cost was appropriate. She did not move closer to the fire. She did not need to. They reached Ashvale on the 3rd morning, when the light was still horizontal and gold across the valley's face, and the court buildings came into view through a break in the pine ridge, stone walls the color of winter wheat, banners in deep blue catching a faint ridge wind, smoke from a dozen chimneys rising in orderly parallel columns. The pups went quiet in the particular way they went quiet when they were moved by something they didn't yet have words for, and Merrin knew the feeling completely. The gate guards saw Theron and opened without ceremony. Word preceded them through the court somehow. She could see it in the way people appeared in doorways and at windows, not threatening, simply watching. An alpha returning with strangers was news. An alpha returning with an omega and 4 children was a different category of news, and she could see the calculation happening in faces as they passed, the rapid social arithmetic of rank and standing and what this meant. She kept her chin level. The court healer, a tall woman named Avrin, who moved with the efficient grace of someone who had been solving problems for decades, was waiting at the inner courtyard gate. She looked at the pups with professional assessment, asked their ages and whether they had eaten, and began organizing them with such warm directional competence that all four followed her toward the healer's hall without protest, Fen glancing back once at Marin with a look that said both, "I'm all right," and "Don't go far." Marin watched them go. She was standing in the inner courtyard, which was stone and morning light and the smell of horses and pine resin, and somewhere, something baking, and she was still dressed in travel clothes that had seen 3 days of winter road, and the pull was so present now inside their proximity to each other, Theron standing 2 feet to her left, not touching, not pressing, that she could feel her own heartbeat as a separate entity. "They'll be well here," he said. He meant the pups. "I know," she said. She felt the truth of it settle through her. Not naively, but as the recognition of something she had assessed and found real. Avrin's hands on Fen's shoulders had been gentle. The court's walls were solid. The healer's hall had 2 fireplaces visible from the door. The pups would be well. "And you?" he said. She turned and looked at him fully. In the full light of the courtyard, there was nothing the firelight had been softening. She could see the tiredness around his eyes, 3 days of ridge road and watchful attention, and the effort of not being what he was not yet permitted to be. She could see the cost of the restraint he had maintained since the settlement doorway, and she understood it had cost him considerably, and she understood also that it had been chosen, every hour of it, as a gift to her rite of pace. She took 1 step toward him. He went very still in the way of large things that were trying not to startle small things, which she found so precisely right that something in her chest gave way entirely. She put her hand flat against his sternum, the same place the pull lived in her own body. He put his hand over hers. "The council will challenge it," she said. "Everything. My status, the pup's standing, the statute revision." "Yes," he said, "they will. You could still not do this. Return me under Watchtower jurisdiction. Resolve the political problem." His hand pressed her hand more firmly against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat under her palm. "I could not," he said. "Not because of the bond, because of who you are. How could I not want the woman who went down into a cellar for 14 months and named 4 children who had been given numbers? How could I not claim the woman who taught pups to breathe small and then found them somewhere large enough to breathe as big as they needed?" He said it quietly and without performance, and it landed in her like a key into a lock she had not known was installed. She looked at her hand on his chest and his hand over hers. "Then we handle the council," she said. "Together," he said. "Together," she agreed. He brought his other hand up to her jaw, slow enough that she could have moved away from it, tilted her face up with a gentleness that was not tentative but asking, and she answered by closing the remaining distance herself, which made something in the quality of his restraint finally release. She felt it go, felt him lean into the kiss with the careful force of something that had been held back for 3 years of unknowing distance and 3 days of deliberate waiting, and she kissed him back with the same force, because she too had been waiting, and was done. The mate bond moved through them in a wave, not violent, not cinematic, nothing dramatic enough to require an audience. A warmth from the sternum outward, filling the places where the pull had created a shape by its long absence, settling into the space behind her ribs with the feeling of something returning to its correct position after a very long misalignment. She made a sound against his mouth that she had not planned to make. He made an answering sound low in his chest. They stood in the courtyard in the morning light, and the bond settled between them like a resolved cord, all its notes finally finding their correct intervals. She thought of Fen asking, "Good far or bad far?" She would tell her, later, that the answer had been both, in sequence, and that the far part was finished now. The council sent 3 formal representatives to Ashvale within the fortnight. Theron met them in the Great Hall, with Merrin seated to his right, in the unambiguous position of the court's first female authority, which the representatives absorbed with the concentrated effort of people working not to show what they were feeling. The Pups were not present. They were in the healer's hall with Avron, who had in 12 days become the specific object of Fenn's entire investigative attention, and seemed to find this more engaging than burdensome. The council's case was procedural and precise. Merrin was registered Omega, property of the Watchtower system, removed without sanction. The Pups were unverified bloodlines, legal wards of the Tower. The Ashvale statute revision had not been formally approved by the council's full complement. Theron heard them out. Then he stood. "This woman," he said, "removed 4 children from an unregistered subterranean holding facility in which they were being kept without legal designation, educational provision, or named guardianship, a facility that appears in no floor plan filed with this council, which means the Watchtower itself was operating outside its sanctioned parameters. I invite the council to formally challenge the statute revision." He paused. "The counter-challenge will include a full accounting of that cellar." The silence was the kind produced when a situation's trajectory reverses entirely. Merrin watched the 3 representatives look at each other with the rapid private communication of people calculating costs. "The children's standing," the eldest representative said finally, "could be formalized under Ashvale records." "It already has been," Theron said. "As of 3 days ago, their names are Fenn, Rook, Silt, and Reed, and they are registered as court wards in good standing. I will forward the documentation." Another silence. "The Omega's status," the representative said, more carefully. "My mate's status," Theron said, "is Alpha Consort of Ashvale, which supersedes Watchtower jurisdiction by any legal framework the council cares to reference. I recommend it reference them in private before requiring me to do so in session." He said it without loudness. He said it the way a thing was said when it was simply true, and the speaker knew it was true, and was prepared to demonstrate its truth with whatever documentation, testimony, or political cost the demonstration required. Merrin had heard authority performed before. The Tower guards had been loud with it. This was different. This was the sound of a person who had nothing to prove, because the thing was already proven. She pressed her hand flat against the table, and kept her face level, and felt the bond warm in her chest, and was glad. The council withdrew to consider. The formalization came in writing 2 weeks later, terse and without concession of error, which was its own kind of concession. Cale arrived at Ashvale on the same day as the council's letter. He came with his father's second-best horse and a traveling pack, and the uncertain expression of a 17-year-old who had done something large and was not certain how it would be received. Merrin met him at the gate. "You went to the garrison," she said. "I did," he said. "You could have gotten yourself into significant difficulty. I calculated that you could get into more," he said, with the particular precision of someone who had thought about this. She looked at him for a moment, then pulled him into an embrace with the practicality of someone who had decided that sentiment was not the same as weakness. He accepted it with the slight rigidity of someone who was also deciding this. "There's a position in the court healer's hall," she said, stepping back. "Avron needs an apprentice. Theron thought you might consider it." Cale looked at the court buildings with the expression of someone recalibrating his expectations upward. "I might," he said, in a tone that meant yes, absolutely. She walked him inside. Fen was in the courtyard with Rook, demonstrating something with a length of rope that appeared to involve complex knot theory. She looked up when Marin and Kale appeared, assessed Kale for approximately 2 seconds and said, "Are you the one who helped us escape?" "I provided the rope," Kale said. Fen nodded with deep satisfaction, then went back to her demonstration. Rook looked at Kale with his calibrated assessment, then signed something to Silt across the courtyard. Silt signed back. Rook turned back to Kale and said, "We've decided you're trustworthy," in the tone of someone conveying a formal ruling. "I'm honored," Kale said, and meant it. That evening, Marin stood on the upper walkway above the inner court, with her shoulder against the stone and the valley spread below her in the last of the day's gold light. The pups were inside. She could hear Fen's carrying voice from the healer's hall, explaining something to Avron with great authority. The wolves the border scouts had left at the gate had relocated themselves to the courtyard, and the pups had, over the past week, developed a negotiated relationship with them that involved careful, slow approach protocols and, in Fen's case, the gradual establishment of what could only be described as a friendship. Theron came up the walkway stairs and stood beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He was good at the kind of silence that was presence rather than absence. She had learned to read the difference in 3 days of road and 2 weeks of court, and she valued it in a way she had not expected to value anything about a person she had not known a month ago. She leaned into his shoulder. His arm came around her, easy and without ceremony, the way it came when something was established between two people and does not require announcing. "The Valley Settlement sent word," he said. "Bess wants to know if the pups are well." "Send her Fen's latest monologue," Marin said. "She'll understand immediately." He made the sound that was the structure of a laugh. She felt it through his shoulder. Below them, Fen emerged into the courtyard to make some further declaration to the nearest wolf, who received this declaration with the dignified patience of an animal that had seen many things and was not easily flustered. Rook appeared a moment later, positioning himself with his clear sightline to the gate, which he would likely always do, she thought. The watchfulness was part of him now, but here it was not fear, it was simply a thing he did, like Silt and Reed's hand language, like Fen's monologues. Their shapes carried forward from the hard place into the new one. She thought of the pull, the 3 years of it, the direction without a name, the tin box, and the managed coal. She thought of 4 seconds through pine boughs and a face with the quality of looking without taking. She thought of the cellar stairs and the way 4 children had looked up at her in the pre-dawn dark, and the decision that had been not a decision but the only possible response to a real thing seen clearly. She pressed her hand to Theron's chest. He covered it with his. The valley was full of light. The pups were loud below. The bond in her chest was warm and fully settled, and she had been running toward this, all of this, the children and the court and the man beside her and the wolves in the courtyard, for 3 years without knowing it. She knew it now. That was enough. That was, she found, exactly enough.